Professor Erbe here, Speech 301 at American River College. Due to issues beyond our control, we've moved our face-to-face public speaking course to an online format. But don't worry, we're going to get through the class and everything's going to be just great. The next speech that we have on our agenda is, of course, the persuasive speech on a question of policy. So that's what I'm going to talk about today on this video. Now, please remember that this speech, the persuasive policy speech, and the sales speech, we're going to use the same material, the same information. So what we're going to talk about today applies to both the question of policy persuasive speech and the sales speech. Okay, so we're going to kind of kill two birds with one stone here with our discussion today for both of those speeches. So again, all this information applies to both the persuasive speech on the question of policy, which is the next speech we have coming up, and the sales speech as well. So I wanted to make sure you understood that, and so we're all on the same page. So really the first question is, why study persuasion? You know, most of us are not going to work as salespeople or politicians or PR people or these kinds of things where you would think that persuasion would be really important. And in those cases, it would be very important. Of course, if you're in public relations or a politician or in sales, yes, persuasion, or an attorney, maybe a trial attorney, these types of career paths would definitely use persuasion on a daily basis. But what if you're an accountant or an engineer or some of these types of careers where you might not think persuasion is very important? I would say, well, even in those career paths, persuasion is going to be really important, really important. So how so? I mean, I think that's really the question. Why is persuasion so important for us to look at? Well, I would submit to you that every day you're bombarded with messages that are trying to get you to think a certain way or do something. Right now, we're coming up to the presidential election, and all these different folks are trying to get you to persuade you, influence you on, to vote for them, basically. But you also turn on the car radio and somebody's trying to sell you a service or a product. So, you try to convince your boss to give you a raise, for example. So really, in our representative democracy that we have, free speech, the First Amendment, and in our capitalistic society, persuasion's really important to know. So you have to have some sort of idea about how to evaluate the messages that you're being bombarded with every day. And I think knowing something about persuasion helps you deconstruct these messages, assess them, evaluate them, and so you can be a better consumer, if you will, of public messages. I think that's really an important issue there, and really one of the primary reasons why I think studying persuasion is so vital. But also, you want to be able to affect change in your own lives, in your own way as well. So you want to be able to try to influence and persuade people as well. And again, having this basic knowledge of persuasion, I think, will be very helpful in that regard too. So I think, for both of those reasons, persuasion is pretty important to study. Now, we're going to tackle the nuts and bolts of the question of policy persuasive speech today. Later, when we have time, I'll go back and we'll talk about some of the theory behind persuasion, things like cognitive dissonance theory, fear appeals, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. All these different things we'll tackle later. But I wanted to get the nuts and bolts of this next speech done and up on canvas so that you guys can go ahead and start this process of researching and writing your persuasive speech on a question of policy. So we'll start with the nuts and bolts and then progress from there. I think that's a good place to start. Okay, so we got kind of the rationale for why we want to study persuasion, but what is persuasion? That's a good question too, and obviously relevant. So how do we define persuasion? Well, there's lots of different definitions out there. I use one that I got from a book on persuasion from Beddinghouse and Cody. Those are the authors. And I always thought this was a pretty basic, simple, straightforward definition. And the definition is in the PowerPoint slide. I don't know if you can see it or not. Unfortunately, I don't have a large screen. But basically, persuasion is the process by which a communicator attempts to influence the attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors, of another person or group. Let me repeat that. Persuasion is the process by which a communicator attempts to influence the attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors of another person or a group of people in our case. So I think that's a basic definition. Like I said, lots of definitions you could go on the net and look up. That's mine. I think it's a very direct and straightforward definition, and one we can kind of build on. Now, for a message to be considered persuasive, I would say that there's a couple things you want to know or think about. Number one, there must be a goal and intent to persuade. In other words, if I just scratch my head and then somebody else scratches their head a couple of tables down, I wouldn't define that as persuasion. That is to say, I didn't intend, that was not my goal, to persuade that person. I itched my head, they itched theirs. So in persuasion, I think a lot of scholars would support me on this, that persuasion, for it to be persuasion or persuasive, there must be a goal or intent to persuade. That has to be your objective, okay? And number two, communication must be the means through which the goal is achieved, right? So that has to be there as well. Communication has to be the focal point, the means through which that goal is achieved. Communication, not some other thing, but communication, human communication. And finally, and this is very important, the receiver must have free will. You have to have free will to either accept or reject the message that you're faced with in that persuasive context. You have to have the ability to say, yeah, okay, I'll buy the car, or no, I won't buy the car, or okay, I'm going to vote for this person, or I'm not going to vote for this person. Okay, you can't be coerced, forced, and this really makes persuasion tough, right? Because the person does have this free will, must have this free will for it to be persuasive, and they can accept or reject it. And that relies totally on how you construct that message. It's really up to you, the sender of the message. How much evidence are you going to use? What kind of evidence? Are you going to use emotional appeals? That's the pathos. How much credibility do you have? That's the ethos. Your logic appeal, the logos. All the rhetorical proofs that Aristotle talked about in the rhetoric. So you have to be able to frame that message in a way that's going to be persuasive for that target audience. And there's no guarantee, there's no absolutely certainty that you're going to be able to persuade people. It's very tough to do so because they do have free will and they can make choices and decisions. And there's a lot that comes into that. I've named some of those just a second ago. But those three things have to be there for it to be persuasive, okay? So what do we talk about so far? Let's kind of backtrack here. So we talked about the rationale for studying persuasion. We talked about one of many definitions of persuasion. And we talked about three of the components or elements that should be there if we are to call it persuasion or persuasive, okay? So let's move on now. Now the next thing I want to talk about are questions or claims of fact, value, and policy. Questions of fact, value, and policy. And again, this is in your readings. I don't know if you can see it, but I think if we focus the camera a little closer here. So these are the three claims or questions. Your author uses the term questions, and that's fine. Three claims or questions of persuasion. Those are fact, claims or questions of value, and claims or questions of policy. Okay? So we're going to do a question of policy in this class for our graded speech coming up. But what I'd like to do is very briefly discuss all three of them and compare and contrast, just to give you a sense of what a policy statement is and is not. I think that's would be very helpful. Okay, so let's start with fact, because that's obviously the first one on my PowerPoint slide. Now, some facts, they can be answered absolutely. For example, if I said to you, who was the first African American to be on the Supreme Court? And you thought for a second, oh, gee, Clarence Thomas. No, that wouldn't be Clarence Thomas. He might be the best known, but he wasn't the first. Thurgood Marshall was the first African American to sit on the Supreme Court. Now, you can go back and look at different historical documents, facts. You can do all sorts of research on the net. You can ask the reference librarian. You can ask historians. And I guarantee you that it'll all point to one direction, and that is Thurgood Marshall. No doubt about it, Thurgood Marshall. Not Clarence Thomas, Thurgood Marshall. And no reasonable person, let's say, would dispute that fact. However, some questions of fact cannot be answered absolutely. For example, I watched a news program not too long ago, and they had two different geologists from the same geology department. I don't know if it was Caltech or where they were from exactly. I don't remember. But they were from the same department, and they were both having a debate about when the next big one, right, the big earthquake's going to hit. And they both had their research, they both had their evidence, right, the statistics and examples and scientific data and all these different facts and support evidence, right? But they were coming to different conclusions about when the next big earthquake was going to hit. And so you have to, as a receiver of the message, you have to weigh that information, hear both sides, evaluate it, assess it, because now you're going to know something about persuasion, right, and evidence and how to weigh it and assess it. But you have to come to some determination. Who's right? This person or the other person. I'll give you another example. In November of '63, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, and many people believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman who perpetrated the crime. Now, there was a movie that came out by Oliver Stone not too many years ago called JFK, and they dealt with this issue. And the theory behind it was the grassy knoll theory, meaning that there was another gunman and a plot and a conspiracy to kill JFK. And the movie, just to give you a reference point, was a star in it, I believe, was Kevin Costner. Now, we can have a debate about, I believe it was the Warren Commission came out with this document that said, yes, it was one gunman, but there was this grassy knoll theory. Now, I've heard various debates from various intelligent people with seemingly good research and evidence, making their different arguments about either lone gunman or the grassy knoll theory, meaning another shooter was on this grassy knoll area near where Kennedy was shot. So I don't know. I don't have the answer. But I say even in a court of law, lawyers, right, they present their different facts in their case to try to persuade a jury that someone, let's say, is guilty or innocent. So when we can't answer something absolutely, like who was the first African American to sit on the U.S. Supreme Court, right? Then persuasion comes into play. All right, so that's a question of fact. A question of value, here the speaker attempts to persuade the audience that something is, let's say, moral or immoral, right or wrong, good or bad. And typically what they do here to organize their speech is it's topically, and they'll have some sort of standard that they use. And I think in chapter 12 in Lucas, they talk about bicycling as the best transportation plan. And they'll have this standard about what that best transportation plan would entail, right? And go back in that chapter and look. It's pretty clear, pretty good example. And then they show how their plan, which would be this kind of the second main point, how it follows that ideal standard. Okay? So that would be a question of value. Okay, you're trying to persuade people that something is the best plan or a good thing or the best, these types of things. Something that's moral or immoral. Abortion is one topic, public policy-wise, that you see this back and forth, right? And of course, one side says one thing, if people have an abortion, they're immoral and they're criminal and all these things. And the other side will say things like, well, it's a woman's right to choose and this is the standard. So, but these are all questions of values, deciding or persuading that something is good or bad, right or wrong, moral or immoral. And remember, the way that you would organize that is having some sort of ideal standard, and then you show how your position meets that ideal standard. Okay? All right. So let's go on now to a question or claim of policy. A question or claim of policy argues for a particular course of action. Okay? So basically, should we or should we not take a particular course of action? That's a question or claim of policy. So, for example, let's say, now in California we have marijuana is now legal for both medicinal and recreational purposes, and I believe the age is 21. Let's say, for the sake of argument for the moment, that it was not legal in California. In many states it is not. And in the federal government doesn't recognize that it's legal as well, by the way. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, though, that marijuana was not legal in California. So what are you going to do? Well, your specific purpose statement might be something like, to persuade my audience that we should legalize marijuana in California. Okay, so there's your specific purpose statement, right? We talked about that earlier in class when we were all in the face-to-face environment. So what are you going to do? Well, for a question of policy, you're going to have both kind of a need and a solution. That's the basic organizational format that you see for these types of persuasive messages on a question or claim of policy. A need and then solution. Need or problem and solution, right? Need is equal to problem, by the way, okay? So when I say need, I mean problem. When I say problem, I mean need. For our purposes in persuasion, need is equal to problem. Okay, so for these types of questions of policy speech, you're going to have problem-solution order of some various sort. And we're going to get more into that in a second. But remember, it's very important. Need is equal to problem, okay? All right, so what are you going to do for need? How are you going to demonstrate there's a problem with not allowing marijuana to be legal? Well, you're going to talk about things like all the incarceration rates that cost us all these millions and millions of dollars to house people who are found guilty of possession of marijuana. You're going to talk about the cost of it. So these are the kinds of things you're going to talk about in the problem section. Need, okay? But again, the important point here is that you make sure that you're arguing for a particular course of action, one that we should take or one that we shouldn't take. You could just do the opposite of that. No, I want to persuade all of you that we should keep marijuana illegal in California, right? So again, it's a course of action. Now, do you have questions of fact and value in questions of policy? Absolutely. So if I said to you, well, my speech, and I'm going to put it in very formal terms here with a specific purpose, to persuade my audience that we need to clean up our coastal areas, right? So that's your specific purpose, right? Our beaches are filled with toxic water and sewage runoff, and it's just a mess. And in many places in our state, that's very true. So, but are there elements of fact and value in that question of policy? Yes. What are facts? Well, we can go down to the water at a local beach, and we can test the housing, or excuse me, the public health organization can, in the county, let's say, can test the water, see if it has high levels of bacteria in it or whatnot. And those are facts, right? Scientifically based facts. Either the water is polluted or it is not. It is either safe to swim in or it is not. And we can use science, right, factual bits of information from scientific study to determine whether or not that water has high levels of bacteria or not, and is it safe to swim in or not. Okay, so there's a fact issue, but also there is a value issue, right? And that is that we value, for example, health. I mean, right now we have this coronavirus, right? That's why we've gone to a remote format, and we value health. And so we're taking all these steps to make sure that people are as safe as possible. Well, that's what the counties do with respect to testing their beach water, right? The ocean water at their local beaches. And so we have this value about what do we think is good or bad, and or acceptable or not acceptable. And having clean ocean water for people to swim in and have a good time in, that's high on our list of things that are important. So, but we're still, at the end of the day, going a step further and arguing for a particular course of action. Okay? So yes, you can find elements of fact and value in questions of policy, but ultimately we are arguing for a particular course of action, one that we should take or one that we shouldn't take. Okay? So those are the claims or questions of fact, value, and policy. Okay? Now, with respect to the basic policy issues, let's talk about that. And I don't know if you can see this here, but I'm going to talk about these next because they have a lot to do with questions of policy. Okay? And we're going to talk about 3 basic issues that need to be addressed in any question of policy persuasive speech. And those 3 things are need, plan, and practicality. That's need, plan, and practicality. Now I'm going to leave the camera on this PowerPoint slide for a little bit while I talk so you can jot these things down. Now this is discussed in the Lucas text, but I also want you to be able to write it down now when you're listening to this video lecture, okay? So what do I mean by need? Well, what I mean by need is what I said just a second ago, right? If you remember, I said need is equal to problem. Needs equal to problem. So you want to convince the audience that there is a serious and significant problem with the status quo or the way things are. For example, if you think that your local beach is constantly polluted, the water quality is horrible, there's always a sign from the county that says closed beach, no swimming, right? Well, I would say that you're probably going to think that there's a significant problem with the way things currently are, right? So you're going to demonstrate there that there is a need to do something about that particular situation, right? So you're going to talk about, well, what's problematic? Well, there's problematic, there's high levels of bacteria in the water. It's a public health issue. People can get really, really sick. In fact, all the years I surfed, I did get sick surfing in water that had high bacteria levels, unbeknownst to me, but I came down with some flu-like symptoms. It was not good. So there's need there, okay? You have to demonstrate need, a significant problem, okay? So what's plan then? Plan is your solution. Okay, so you have all these various problematic issues operating around your local beach and the water quality. What do you propose to do about it? What's your solution? Well, we're gonna have this campaign to clean up the beach. We're gonna march in front of the county offices so that they do something. They enact some legislation. They go through and clean up the water. They work with the EPA in implementing these some program that you come up with, or a program that's already out there. Okay, so some sort of solution that you provide to remedy the problem or need. And then finally, you want to demonstrate that the advocated plan will solve the problem without generating greater harm than the existing problem with your, and will your plan actually solve the problem? Okay, so that's practicality. All right, so you have three things operating here. You have need or the problem, plan or the solution, and practicality. Okay, so you have to demonstrate that your plan's feasible or workable to solve the problem. That's what I mean by practicality. And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can cite a similar plan that's been implemented elsewhere, that's worked, it's right, similar to your plan and it's worked. That's a pretty good one. That's a strong way to demonstrate practicality. Or another way, you can cite different experts who will support your particular plan that you come up with, or the one that you found somewhere in your research. And those are very good ways, or methods to demonstrate practicality. But remember, in any question of policy, you have three basic issues that you have to deal with: need or the problem, plan or the solution, and practicality. That feasibility, that workability with your plan, and those two ways in which you demonstrate practicality. Okay, so finally, let's talk about how we're actually going to organize our speech. Okay, it's called Monroe's motivated sequence. Monroe's motivated sequence, and there are 5 steps to it. There's attention getter, right? When we talked about that quite a bit when we were in our face-to-face public speaking environment. And then need, satisfaction, visualization, and action. Again, attention getter, need, satisfaction, visualization, and action. Now, the attention getter, again, can be some dramatic statements, statistics, a visual aid, a combination of those things, a story that you tell. And after you're done with that, then you're going to have the specific purpose statement, whatever that is, okay? So that's all in the introduction of the speech. The body of the speech is going to include the need, satisfaction, and visualization, okay? So that's the body of the speech. So again, need is simply the problem, demonstrating there's a problem with the way things currently are, for example. Satisfaction is how you satisfy the need. Again, this is one of those words, again, like need, where you think, oh, satisfy. But we're not using these terms as they're normally used in everyday walks of life. So need is not what we need to do, but it's the problem. Satisfaction is not satisfying something or being satisfied. It is the solution or the plan. Now, visualization, the third and final main point in the body of the speech, that's how we benefit from your plan. And so how do we as a society or a group of people benefit from adopting your plan? And you have to think long and hard about this, right? What's in it for us? I think that's a question that a lot of audience members will ask. When somebody says, well, vote for me, oftentimes people will say, if I vote for you, what's in it for me? How do I benefit from checking your name on the ballot? And I think that's a great question for an audience member to ask. I really do. On all sorts of different types of topics. But visualization is how we benefit from your plan. And you have to think about that long and hard to come up with some really, really important issues. Interestingly, if you're talking about different problems, you could reverse those and turn those into benefits in the visualization section. But remember, this is very important. Make sure that you don't mix these up. Oftentimes people will have visualization and need, or satisfaction and visualization. Okay? So make sure that each section does one thing. Need talks about the problem. That's it. Doesn't do anything else but that. That's its objective. Satisfaction only discusses the solution or plan and discusses the practicality of the plan. Visualization only discusses, in that particular section, benefits of adopting the plan. That's it. Okay? Now finally, the call to action. This is where you reinforce the specific purpose, and in this case, you tell the audience exactly what they need to do. Vote for me, make a call to your congressperson, picket in front of the county offices, sign up for that health club, whatever it is. But in the call to action, you reinforce the specific purpose and give people some specific directions about what exactly you want them to do in support of the plan. Okay? So this really kind of concludes our little lecture, our video lecture on the next speech, the persuasive speech on a question of policy. I'll be looking forward to answering all of your emails, and we'll go from there. But this should give you really the nuts and bolts for putting together the next speech. And remember, I have a Friend in Need speech video queued up on Canvas. You have the outline for that speech that I gave you while we were in our face-to-face environment. So you can follow along with that speech. And pay close attention to each of those sections on that Friend in Need outline, especially need, okay? Especially the concept of need. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I look forward to answering all of your questions, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you.